Thank you, Matt, and thank you everyone for being here. Looking forward to this conversation on education and workforce issues. One more reminder, texastribune.org/ask. I will get your questions right here on my phone. If I'm looking at my phone, I'm not playing the Wordle. I am reading your questions, and I will try to sprinkle them in throughout the conversation. But thank you all both for being here. All right. So let's talk a little bit. I mean, this is an education conversation. This was, of course, a very big session for education, came in kind of being, I would say, maybe the most hyped issue on the table. A lot of attention going to the issue of school vouchers, school choice, and things like that. But I actually want to start with HB2, which you could argue may be more consequential than the school voucher bill, and will really have a lasting impact on education in the state and for the people in the state. Can y'all sort of break down for me first kind of the big picture look at that bill, and then we'll get into some kind of the details beyond there?
Yeah, great. And I would agree with you in terms of the size and scope, because when we think about the size of the school voucher program, it's about 2%, 3% of the children in Texas. So when we're talking about HB2, that's the other 97%. That's millions and millions of children whose lives will be improved by this bill. Marilyn, do you want to dive in what's in there?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, House Bill 2 is an $8.5 billion investment in our public schools on top of the $80, $90 billion that we're already putting into our public school system. So it's a significant investment in and of itself. But I think one of the great things that House Bill 2 does is it attempts to solve a lot of the problems that we're experiencing in public education right now. Less than half of our students can read or do math on grade level, according to the kind of the nation's report card, or the NAEP. And then at the same time, we have a crisis in too many uncertified teachers in the classroom. About half of the teachers that were hired in the state of Texas recently are uncertified. This is a big deal because an uncertified teacher has been shown by research to cause about a 4-month decline in reading proficiency. And so that means we have a lot of big systemic problems that we have to address that House Bill 2 starts to work towards. It does things like paying teachers more to keep our teachers in the classroom. It does reading and math screeners so that we can begin to address these problems that we have in proficiency in the earliest grades. It also puts more money into the pockets of school districts by providing hundreds of millions of dollars in special education funding that districts were sorely needing. So it's structurally designed to address a lot of these systemic issues, and that's why I think it has so much promise.
Okay, let's talk about the funding first, because that is a big part of this. $8.5 billion, as you mentioned. That is a lot of money, being touted as the kind of biggest individual investment in Texas schools in history. It follows a period of, I think, real financial difficulty for schools. A lot of schools running deficit budgets. There was, of course, some money held back in the last legislative session because the school voucher bill could not come through. Help me kind of put this in context of kind of what the impact of this does, and what do we know about how far this will go toward addressing some of the deficit issues that school districts around the state have been facing?
So one of the things that I think we have to do is always kind of pull up and think about the context of the past few years. In 2019, we had a $6 billion investment in public education, and then the pandemic happened. And then we had somewhere between 17 and $19 billion in federal assistance coming to districts, but that money was always going to expire. And so this session, we were at this precipice. The money that districts had become accustomed to from the federal government was going away. We needed to continue investments. Meanwhile, inflation, the cost of living, particularly for our teachers, going up and up. And so I do think that House Bill 2 was of the moment. It was well timed. It will help districts address some of these budget issues, but we're going to continue to see some of those going forward as well.
Okay. And now let's go into some of those provisions, right? One of the big ones, as you mentioned, is teachers. So there's things related to certification. There's also just teacher pay, right? Significant increases or money set aside for raising teacher salaries this year. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so it pays based on experience, kind of at the start. So what it does is around $2,000 to $5,000 for our more new teachers, and then for our more experienced teachers, somewhere between $5,000 to $10,000, depending on the school district. And then it also does things like include funding to encourage teachers that are uncertified and currently in the classroom to go and get certified. So it's doing a lot, and then it's also got some other protections for teachers. It's a very teacher-focused and pro-teacher piece of legislation.
I want to drill into the uncertified question, because this is one that really fascinates me. We have seen in recent years a massive increase of uncertified teachers coming into the classroom and teaching in Texas schools. What is the reason for that?
I think one of the problems is, we've had a lot of jobs that we've needed to fill in our school districts, in part because we had a large surplus of money coming in from the pandemic, and districts were trying to find people to do the job of remediating students after the single greatest learning loss we've seen in the history of our country. And so that created a very unique point in time. But then also we saw people just less interested in becoming a teacher. I mean, if you think about your friends and neighbors, how many of them do you think are actively talking to their sons and their daughters about becoming teachers? That's not really one of the careers that people are turning their children to. And I think that's a tragedy, because one of the things that I think is truly remarkable about the teaching profession, if you think about it, if you think about a teacher trying to provide reading instruction to a class of second graders, she's got, let's say, 22 second graders in her class. She's literally doing neurosurgery. She's individually providing remediated instruction or differentiated instruction to different students based on different needs. Is there any job more complex than that? I think the level of skill that's required to truly become a master teacher is something that we just haven't acknowledged much as a country. And I think it's something that House Bill 2 is a piece of us beginning to turn the tides toward. We need to continue to focus on lifting up the profession.
Yeah, and I think one of the real goals, and this started with House Bill 3 in 2019 and really kind of put on steroids by House Bill 2 this session, is not just the across-the-board pay raises, not just the differentiation based off of the style of certification, but truly rewarding the highest performing teachers as determined by their school district. So we have those tiers, those master teachers under House Bill 3. Before it was you get up to $32,000 extra per year. Now it's even higher after House Bill 2. That is a significant amount of money in terms of getting the highest performing teachers into those six-figure ranges, because these are hard jobs and we want the best and brightest going into them. We want people to see a career, not just a transient stop. And because experience matters, training matters. And over the long term, these investments in our human capital of the teacher workforce will pay off for the overall state workforce.
Yeah, talk a little bit more about that experience matters. I mean, because a lot of the advocates calling for steps in this range, we're really talking about how that training, there are kind of, there is data that would demonstrate that this is really important in terms of student outcomes, right? In order to have those certified and trained teachers on, in the classroom.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that we've seen in the data is that an uncertified teacher causes around 4 months of kind of learning loss or learning lag in reading and around 3 months in mathematics. That's a huge problem when you have a large number of students in the state that are already coming into each and every grade with a deficit.
Yeah, I would add that it's not just about having a great teacher that's well paid. You have to equip them to succeed. The state has made big investments in high quality curriculum. The state is making investments in additional days to the school year this session. Those are things that address learning loss. Those are things that help even your best teachers succeed more. I think that when you think about this as a comprehensive strategy, not just one thing in isolation, that's where the real benefit of House Bill 2 and many of the other pieces that were passed this session come through.
How would you what would you sum up that strategy as? I mean, what is the overarching strategy they're taking here?
Conveniently, it's in House Bill 2 and House Bill 120. They redefine the goals of public education this session. It's a part of that isn't talked about a lot, but there's literally at the top of the education code, we talk about what are we trying to achieve here with this, $70-80 billion in annual investment and millions of Texas children. It is not just reading on grade level, math on grade level. That's what we said before. Now we have added 2 key goals to the goal of public education. First, we want all children who graduate from a Texas public high school to graduate career ready for the workforce of Texas. And we want to make sure that every Texas child who wishes to pursue post-secondary education can do so without the need for remediation. Those are really high standards, really high goals. When you think about, the economy and what our future needs are, that's the kind of stuff that's going to leverage the fact that Texas has more children. We have 10% of America's children are in Texas public schools. When you think about what it's going to take to drive the economy forward for decades to come, it's leveraging that career readiness, that college readiness, and making sure our kids are ready for the economy of tomorrow.
So there was an agreement on this strategy. The question then is, was it enough? How much is this going to move kind of the ball forward and toward those goals?
In terms of student outcomes or in terms, yeah. So I think that's really the most important thing. So I think every piece of education legislation that we pass every session just has to come down to this fundamental question. Are more children going to read and do math on grade level, or are more children going to graduate ready for college and career? And I think that House Bill 2 does move the needle towards both of those things. I think from the early literacy interventions to the things that it's doing in like career and technical education, it is absolutely going to move the ball forward. And every session we're going to come back. I mean, my whole career, everyone's always been like, this is not an education session. And then it always ends up becoming an education session. So next session, when we find ourselves in another education session, we'll continue to find more ways to improve those three metrics.
Let's talk about something that did not make it across the finish line, the accountability bill, HB 4, I believe, if I have it right. Tell us a little bit about what was on the table there and how we ended up.
Yeah, I think the House Bill 4 had various permutations depending on where it was in the process. I think that while a lot of the conversation was about the differences between the bills, there's a lot in common between them. I think regardless of where you were in the House or the Senate or on the political spectrum, everyone agreed that it was time to move away from the STAR exam to this idea of a through-year assessment. We needed to know how kids were doing at the beginning of the year, how they're doing in the middle of the year, and how they're doing at the end. We wanted to make sure that the STAR could be, or the subsequent assessment could be used to drive instruction, to allow intervention, not just after kids have left for the summer, they get a score. People wanted tests back faster. They wanted them to be shorter. They wanted them to be more tailored in an adaptive way so that you could sit down in a few minutes and get an understanding. All of that was generally agreed upon between all the stages of the bill. Unfortunately, there are trade-offs when one are doing these tests. And I think those trade-offs really came at the end, and they ran out of time without being able to resolve them. So, when you think about, there was a provision in the bill that said you could have no questions above grade level. Well, if you're trying to design an adaptive test that's as short as possible, one of the ways that you do that is by asking questions that are too hard. And that's how you can very quickly figure out how the test should be structured. So when you put in these provisions that make it contradictory and impossible to implement, and then you run out of time at the end before you're able to resolve that, it leads to some challenges. But what leads me optimistic is how frankly close I think the sides were at the end. And so we have, 2 years to get this right. And I do think that in 2027 they will.
Before we move on to some more career workforce, I do want to ask an audience question, which was, you mentioned briefly teacher student ratios. Will there still be a shortage of teachers in the aftermath of this law? What will this do for the teacher student ratios in this state?
I do think it's worth noting that the teacher student ratio conversation is one that is a data quirk in Texas of sorts. At the same time, the conversation has been about the difficulty in hiring new teachers and hiring quality teachers. We've also had more teachers employed in Texas public classrooms than at any point in Texas history. We've also had the best student-to-teacher ratios than at any point in Texas history. So there's this push-pull going on in terms of these various pressures. I think some of the things that are being done in the bills in terms of mentorship and grow your own and developing some of the things that we've seen really work in communities, like what El Paso is doing in terms of their mentorship program, partnering with UTEP, getting those student teachers in there and then having them graduate ready to immediately walk into a classroom, scaling those kinds of highly productive models. You see that throughout House Bill 2, whether it's the rural CTE programs or the PTEC programs that have been thriving up in the Dallas area. These things that are highly impactful, and we can show with the data that when there's proper implementation, it drives incredible outcomes for teachers and for students. All of that is scaled by House Bill 2.
Okay, let's talk about the kind of career education space, at high schools, community colleges, and things like that. There were several bits of legislation, dating back to past sessions, but, carrying that momentum forward this time. What are the ones that stand out to y'all as the most exciting, the most interesting that the legislature passed this year?
One of the things that I think has been very exciting is the state's commitment to community college finance and making sure that we have what I think is probably the best community college finance system in the country. And with bills like SB 1786, making sure that we can clean up some of the issues with the prior version of the legislation and make sure that things like credentials of value are going to be at the highest level of quality. And one of the things that I think is so exciting and so innovative that the legislature did is actually make it so that when we have a credential of value conversation, we're not talking about really at the state level. We can pull a credential value at the state level, but we can also do it at the regional level. I'm from Abilene. The jobs in Abilene are vastly different than the jobs in Austin, vastly different than the jobs in El Paso or in Diboll. And so making sure that we're actually regionalizing our credentials of value is just, I think, one of those things that's just going to help continue to support economies, particularly the rural ones or the more remote ones in our state. That, coupled with the reforms that were in House Bill 2 or House Bill 120 around investing and expanding career and technical options like innovative high schools like the PTech model or the RPAP model, I think will continue to just kind of build this out. You know, one of the things, going back to the data and going back to how are our students actually doing, there's a 10 percentage point gap between the performance of young men and young women when it comes to higher education attainment in Texas. We have got to provide programs for our young men that they're interested in and that they want to pursue so that they have just as much access to good jobs that can support a family.
Yeah, I think what we're doing right now in high school in Texas today is going to be the national model. So you hear a lot of coverage about the Mississippi Miracle, all the things they've done for reading. What we're doing in high school, what we're building on high school is going to be what every other state is copying in the next 5 years. We know that in part because they're already copying us on community colleges. And what we are doing right now through House Bill 2, House Bill 120, and Senate Bill 1786 is scaling that community college into high school with that idea of career connectivity, workforce exploration. A lot of bills have passed this session that really drive at that idea. And to Mary Lynn's point, what I see when I look at these bills is it's no longer just about the triangle. It's a 254 county economic development strategy, leveraging our human capital in every area about how to meet their regional workforce demands. We're fixing the systems, the incentives, the data behind the scenes to make it truly a vibrant workforce picture for the 30 million Texans.
I was in Colorado earlier this week with a bunch of higher education administrators and leaders, and they talked a lot about Texas, not all of it positive, but one of the things that
They're one of the ones calling us.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. One of the things that they did talk about a lot was HB 8 from last session and how that had become sort of a national model and something that folks want to emulate and follow very much so after that. Okay, I want to go back to an audience question here. Did the recent ledge session address any of the challenges related to the school financing formula, particularly recapture?
So one of the questions that we always get when it comes to school finance is recapture. And so I want to first ground us in, well, what is recapture? Recapture is just a mechanism to ensure equity in the school finance system. Before we put recapture in place, there was a 700-to-1 ratio difference in the most affluent schools in the least affluent schools in school finance. So when it comes to recapture, it is a tool to lower that ratio to the smallest amount that we can. And so I'll say anytime that you put more money in public education, you lower recapture. So yes, it did lower recapture, but recapture will continue because I think in Texas, it's not something that we're going to accept that one district would have 700 times more funding than another district.
There was a pretty strong commitment in both chambers to putting a significant amount of money into schools this session, using that large surplus in large part to support the schools. One of the things that they sort of had to iron out was what to allocate that money for. How much of it do you want to put into the basic allotment, which can be spent for, a lot of different reasons, or how much do you want to specifically target that for things like teacher raises or other options? Can you tell us a little bit about how that kind of breakdown ended up, and does it carry significance, the decisions they made along those lines?
So one of the ways, kind of at a high level, so House Bill 2 spent $8.5 billion. Around $1 billion of it went to the allotment for basic cost. And then $4 billion plus went towards paying teachers more. A couple $100 million, around $700 or $800 million, went to special education. And then the rest of the money was spent kind of in programmatically directed ways, we'll say. So when you think about House Bill 4, majority of it's going to teachers. We're literally into the pockets of teachers across the state. Others of it are going to school systems to help them improve the way that they're operating and allow them to pay other staff besides teachers more money. And then I think one of the things that we should continue to focus on is special education and continuing to think about bettering that formula. That's going to be a huge piece of work over the legislative interim to make sure that the formulas that we're constructing around special education, which still largely have to be written, are doing the very best things possible for children in the most differentiated way possible, because particularly our special education students just have vastly different needs.
Very good. Okay, I'm going to go to another audience question, which is right now, our school districts are cutting arts programs, particularly those that are not the largest or most popular. I'm hearing that more money is being invested into schools. Why the discrepancy? Is there a lag for when more money will be available to schools? What is the effect of the movement to focus more on basics rather than, quote, extras, such as arts education?
So one of the things that I think that we have to remember too is that in Texas we do still believe in local control, and we do still believe in districts getting to make the budgetary decisions that they need to support their communities and what their community is interested in. But school districts are also grappling with this phenomenon of the patterns of their enrollment are deeply changing. You know, you have some suburban school districts with the west side of the district growing at 10% a year, and then the east side of the district is actually declining in attendance. And school districts are having to balance all of these things and having to keep some schools open that are at 40 or 50% capacity. And that creates downstream budget consequences that the district has to deal with. I think that the posture of the state should be to continue to allow districts to make local budgetary decisions while we're also continuing to encourage them to advance things and improve student outcomes in the 4 core subjects. So.
Okay, and one other question, and I appreciate the audience member for asking. We should talk a little bit about SB2, the school voucher ESA program and everything like that. You know, this was one that passed fairly early in the session. It feels like a long time ago now, but you know, clearly one of the top priorities of the governor, a major change in how we do school funding in the state. What are y'all going to be watching about that program and how it rolls out in the coming months and years?
Yeah, so it'll take some time to get up and running. You know, I don't think this upcoming school year it'll be in place. It'll be the following school year, and so there's a lot that needs to be worked out to make sure that as the program is implemented, it has the level of transparency and accountability that you want over any taxpayer-funded program. I think that there's going to be, just in terms of the operations of it, it's a new thing, and new things can go. You know, there are always hurdles that you have to go through in implementation. We'll have a new comptroller that's going to be tasked with implementing it. Who that is going to be is a big open question right now. So there's a lot of things like that are kind of still unresolved, even though the bill itself is signed and becoming law. So I think that implementation piece and then the follow through at the end to make sure that, you know, again, we are an organization that cares deeply about transparency and accountability over all government funds, regardless of what the program is. And so making sure that we get the outcomes that I think people hoped for.
Okay, we are nearing the end of our time, so I want to just ask an open-ended question to both of you, which is there anything under the radar that you feel like really, you know, people should be thinking about or talking about related to these topics, you know, that passed this session?
Yeah, I think one of the things that has completely been under the radar this session is how good the legislature reformed prison education. So that's not a thing that gets talked about much at all. But through the Texas Department of Criminal Justice Sunset Bill that passed the session, plus some provisions in the Community College Finance Bill, we're going to be able to redo how prison education works, to put educators in charge, be able to leverage dual credit, to have you know, the community colleges more immersed into the prison education context. Because one of the things that we know, and this isn't rocket science, is that if you leave prison with the skills and credentials necessary to find a job, you are more likely to find a job. And if you find a job, you're less likely to recidivate. It's not crazy. But when you look at the data in terms of like the wait lists to get into TDCJ education, you know, it was 1 in 10 students were able to get in under the old system. And the legislature has made massive strides across multiple bills this session to solve that gap, to start closing that, and make education and workforce training a key part of our state's criminal justice policy.
What about you, Marilyn?
I think what I'll add that's under the radar is, again, going back to this meta narrative in Texas. Since 2019, I really truly believe that the legislature has done a phenomenal job in slowly building on these cycles of reform to create a really comprehensive and really strong policy landscape, from House Bill 3's College Career and Military Readiness Outcomes Bonus to the reforms in House Bill 8 with the Community College Finance System, and now continuing to build on that with House Bill 2 and House Bill 120. I think they're pulling in the same direction, and I think that direction is a better Texas. And so I'm a Texas optimist. I'm so thankful for this state, and I'm thankful for the legislature in their kind of coordinated and cohesive approach. And I don't believe that they get the credit that they should for how thoughtful and meticulous that they've been over the past 6 or 7 years.
Excellent. Okay, we have time for, I'll go into one more audience question, which is Texas used to have a strong technical training track, but a lot of that went away in the 1990s. Did that change with this session?
I think that the dignity of technical education has really been a core feature of the legislature over the last couple sessions, and that they've made a lot of key investments. The one I'll point to immediately is they had this session passed an endowment for the Texas State Technical College. You as voters will have the opportunity this November, should you choose to vote. Please do. What that'll do is allow the Texas State Technical Colleges to have an endowment to create new campuses, new labs, et cetera, to really, again, drive in that workforce connectivity in education. It has been a consistent theme throughout. I mean, in redefining the goals of public education to include workforce readiness as a bare minimum for every Texas student. That's 370,000 students per year that we're putting that kind of on right there. That is such a huge step and so responsive to the things that Marilyn was talking about. When we talk about, like, we have this problem in Texas, 90% of our kids are graduating. That is awesome. That is really high. About 60% of jobs require some sort of post-secondary degree or credential, and about 30% of our youth are getting them. Getting that 30 closer to first 60, hopefully all the way up to 90, that is the task of the next few years. And between the bills that have passed, we are certainly on that trajectory. And it's why I believe that we are going to be the national model, because we have not only the humans, but the resources to go off and rewrite what education means.
Excellent. Well, the two of you, I'm sure, had a very busy legislative session. Thank you for joining us on a Friday morning. I know you're already doing the work on 2027, but hopefully you get some rest. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.